All right, today we're talking about a common topic, which is as parents, we all want to provide for our kids. But how does that pan out? And what does that look like? And what are the pros and cons of providing our kids in different ways? And we're talking specifically about financial provisions as they mature through their life. So Jeremiah and I, as we were preparing for this, we're talking about some situations when growing up, we know that our parents were asking us to pay for something that they knew and we knew we were totally not ready to take on the actual expense. So Jeremiah, you had a couple stories to share. Yeah.
Yeah. What we're talking about too is adult children, not kids. And full disclaimer, our kids are still young. So we're talking about our experiences as becoming young adults with our parents, as well as many of the clients and scenarios that we've walked through of people trying to support their adult children, whether they're young adults or older adults financially, but also not creating dependency and doing it in a way that's really healthy. So I guess one I would have is that when I was going through college, my parents very generously, they said they could pay, I was at a state school, they could pay the tuition, but I need to deal with room and board and figure out how I was going to make that work. And it kind of matched. I have an older sister, and that's what they kind of done with her. And so they just kind of took that same system and applied it to me. But the difference was that she was living locally here and so lived at home. I was in Northern California, and so I was having to find housing and food and all that stuff. I think it was a fine choice they made, but it was a onus that I was going to school, working, trying to find a place to live, pay for food, all those things. And so on one side, it was great support. I didn't have to take out loans. I was able to get through, because it was a state school, get through tuition and room and board. And so graduated without loans, which was fantastic. On the other side, I had to work all the way through school. And looking back, I would say that was a good season for me of having to be providing financially as well as studying, feeling the weight of my education in the sense that this costs real money in real time. So that was kind of me personally. They could have just paid for it, but they chose to say, hey, we'll keep it consistent with what we did with another child. This is what we'll pay. That means you got to come up with the rest.
Yeah. I remember coming to my parents in the midst of my 4 years at my undergrad, and we had already worked out a scenario for tuition, but I was interested in going on a study abroad to England. And I knew it would be more expensive than the tuition for that term. And essentially what we ended up working out was there was a loan, kind of a short-term loan that I took out in my name. So I felt the sense of ownership for the cost and the expense, which looking back, I think was really important, because then the study abroad bore a little bit more weight and responsibility to actually utilize it for not just sightseeing, but actual academic purposes. And then at that time, I wasn't working during the school terms, but I was on all the bookends. So at Christmas and over the summer, and trying to save up. And so I knew when I signed up or committed to go to the study abroad that those funds that I had earned the summer before and the holiday break before and the summer thereafter were going to go directly to pay. So it was like, is this one experience worth quantifiable, these three different, times where I sit and work and try to replenish my savings account. So they helped me walk through, without using, the exact terms, that kind of cost benefit analysis. And so looking back, I remark on that as like one of my favorite experiences of my undergrad college year. I have absolute no regrets. And I think from a financial perspective, there was a ton of lessons learned.
Yeah, that's great. And I think those are both good stories of like really good outcomes. I think where, scenarios that we see on a regular basis is someone's going to buy their first house, or they want to help a young married couple, that's their kids, to get in their first home, cars, education, things like that. And on one side, we have stories where we made the hard choice, we got through it, and we gained the benefits. I think there's a lot of parents who are financially stable looking at their adult children and saying, well, if I don't help them now, maybe they'll never get into a house. And or if I don't help them now, maybe the kids will go to this school versus that school. And trying to figure out what's the best way to not create dependence, not create entitlement, but how do you create, confidence, opportunity? How do you build them forward? So that's kind of what we're talking about today of what are the best ways.
And there are, I think, some tips and tricks. And again, we're gleaning from our own experiences as well as those from people that we know and clients that we have. And I think what's common is that the motivation, the sort of heart behind wanting to provide for their kids is very similar across the board. It's just how they choose to do that has potentially drastic differences in the actual outcome. But I think if, for our parents who are listening that have adult children, right, you might identify with those questions or those sentiments of, We want to help them get a good start in life. We're based here in California. We hear often, we know real estate is so expensive in California. We would like to help them get into their first home. We don't want to create dependency, but how do we know what is an appropriate level to give, or the frequency of giving or helping them out? If I say yes to a request, a financial request, is that ultimately going to hurt them in the end, right? And so I think some of that thought process and some of the sentiment can be very similar across the board. And I would acknowledge, any of our listeners, that that's a great place to start, is that you have found yourself in a position, hopefully in life, where your needs are met. You anticipate your needs throughout the duration of your life are met. And now you're looking at the excess and you're saying, okay, what would benefit the next generation, my kids and or grandkids, and how do we choose to do that?
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the how and the what, and then we'll talk about the kind of logistics of some tips and tricks, like you said, how to potentially do this in a way that is useful. So the first one is, I think, a few filters of the first filter you already mentioned. Can I afford this? I think the first question is, we wouldn't want a client of ours or even anyone out there to say, hey, I'm going to sacrifice my retirement or my financial well-being to try and help someone else that's a family member. People do it all the time, right? That's a normal one. But what we're talking about here is when your retirement is set, your finances, what's the airplane one? Please secure your own mask and then help
before the mask
help with
of others.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think it's that moment of saying, first filter, can you afford to help them? And then the second is, does the kind of the helping that you're considering, does it align with your values? Values like education, values like home ownership, values like financial independence. Then the next one I would put on as a filter, is this like a temporary either opportunity or band-aid, or is this a long-term expectation? And that is a hard one, right? Because even if you said, if someone asks, hey, mom and dad, could we borrow some money to do this thing? You may say yes or no, but like, is that now an expectation that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or are there other siblings, right? That also might say, oh, well, this happened with one sibling. I feel like that should happen to me as well. And not to say there's a right or wrong, but those are some filters I would consider.
Yeah. And I like that lens where you're saying, like, okay, if I consider this as a short-term or a one-off request or more of a long-term ongoing request, I think the other layer that I would put on top of that is this an opportunity to create greater responsibility or ownership of the decision or the financial outcome? How could I structure this in such a way where I am potentially helping them from a financial perspective, but it's not that they're completely off the hook, so to speak? So going back to my earlier example, it was important that the loan that I took out for the study abroad was in my name. And it seems like something simple, but I bore the ownership of that debt, and I was making that choice. And it was a great moment of maturation where I'm saying, okay, it's kind of like the day that you open your first bank account, right? I got my first job. I got my first paycheck. I opened my first bank account. I see my name on that bank statement. I have my ATM card, my credit card, So this, I would say, in these decisions, where is this a one-off request? Is this a short-term or a long-term? Look for ways to create added responsibility, maturity, ownership of the decision. I think is important.
It's a great comment, because what a bummer it would be for a parent generation to provide and pay for a kid and not realize, but they stole that sense of ownership, that sense of standing on your own 2 feet, that sense of I have arrived as an adult. We laugh in our life. We had a year where I finished law school. We started for our first kind of career. We had our first child and we bought our first home. And we just laughed at like, oh, at this year, we very much became adults, like instantly. Like we have
We're
mortgage,
adulting.
a child. Yeah. It was a good trend, but that was a moment to appropriately feel the weight of being an adult at that level. And I think for parents, not accidentally stealing that from their kids, but really allowing them to arrive into their own.
Another conversation that comes up often is, how do I equally or fairly provide if you have multiple children and or multiple grandchildren? Now, this conversation oftentimes comes up in the context of estate planning. So you're talking about after your life, how you want your assets to be transferred to the next generation. But it can also be just as relevant and true during your life. And there are lots of opinions. For our listeners, you might have heard different advice from friends of yours or seen some online. And a couple of things that we talk about is first, consider who it is that is asking you for the gift or that you plan to give the gift to. We all recognize that kids have a variety of different financial behaviors, tendencies. It might be very easy to identify that you've got one kid that's a spender and one kid that's a saver. We can already identify that in our young children. And so I think the type of support from a financial perspective will look somewhat different based on their financial behaviors and their tendencies. The other factor that I would overlay when we think about fairness, quote unquote, is that the needs are different. There have been circumstances for our listeners to consider where one family might have themselves or their kids have special needs or, require a different type of education setting or added support outside of school, or they're not really fit for a traditional 4-year college, but they're looking more for vocational training. Or on the opposite, you might have kids or grandkids who are extremely academically inclined or driven. You anticipate that their need for education funding or otherwise is going to be much greater than other kids. And I think that's kind of complicates that framework. And I would just invite our listeners to be open-minded, because I think if you're held to being equal and fair, and I think that is important, equal and fair, but if you're only defining that by dollars and cents and a black and white sort of computational fairness, I think that it will lead to more difficult conversations than being a little bit more open-minded about how you define the need and the support that would be most helpful, because you're striving towards a similar outcome, right, for your kids and grandkids. But I don't know, Jeremiah, would you have
Yeah.
probably other
No,
ideas
that's
too
great.
there?
No, I think it's a great sentiment that things are going to be slightly different. And even the structural mindset, is it a gift? And in my mind, the first tip, tips and tricks is just clarity of, is this a gift that you were just giving them the money? Is this a loan? Is this going to offset their inheritance? Is this something they can talk about freely with other siblings? Is this something that's very secretive? Like having some of those just discussions of what you're considering, what you want this to be for them. A loan is fine. Interfamily loans, it happens all the time. People do that on a regular basis. And I always encourage people, if you're doing an interfamily loan, man, let's document it. So there's no, hey, was that a loan or a gift? When do I have to pay it back? Is there interest? All of that. Like, let's just get it documented. It can be an easy way to document a promissory note between family members, but it takes away some of that unsaid expectation or unstated thoughts to say, no, this is clear. This is a loan. I expect it to be paid back. I'm going to be generous on the interest rate or generous on the timeline, sure. But this is a loan. This is not something that is a gift. Or if it is a gift, make that very clear. This is a gift. I want you to have it and run with it.
Right. I say all the time, clear is kind. You might have the closest relationship with your family members, and yet still having something in writing, like a promissory note, is still helpful, because you never know what twists and turns and other family members, might be involved. Things can just get complicated really quickly. And so just to resolve that threat of confusion or argument in the future, I always say clear is kind. And I think it's respectful as the nature of your relationship with your kids is changing, right? As they become adults, they're becoming less and less dependent on you. And I think many parents are grasping at an earlier season of parenting where they were still relied upon. And so this is where I would caution our listeners to just make sure that your own emotional maturity going into this is not actually grasping at a greater sense of dependency. The goal is to create, independent, financially stable adult children. And so even that can still be done by giving some financial support, but how it's structured, I think, is meaningful. So to your point, having just some basic agreements in place, if it's a kind of private loan between family members, there's lots of ways to structure benefit. The other comment that I would make is always to consider tax implications, whether it's a gift or something given during life or after life. We won't get into the details for the recording today, but anything from helping fund, education or vocational training during the life, or cable funding, or if you want to just give a direct financial gift, gift or part ownership in a property, and then versus after your life as assets transfer, something that on paper could look very equal, once you factor in the tax liability, could actually be quite drastically different in terms of the net benefit given to the next generation.
Yeah, those are such good comments. I think other things we won't touch on today is kind of like as people have larger estates, they do lifetime gifts purposely to get them out of their estate into the next generation's estate. That's a different discussion. We're talking a lot about more of how do I assist a kid to get through a certain season. And I love your focus, Laura, on is this building what I want to build in them, or is this just rescuing them or even recreating that dependency? I've told the story before. One of our kids was learning to tie their shoes and it was time for us to get out the door. And I had this urge of like, let me just do it. I could do it faster.
It'd be so much faster.
And they're trying and they're intentful and they're doing their best. And man, it's going slow. But it was a good moment for me to be like, I just need to let them struggle, let them figure this out. Otherwise, I wanted them kind of be dependent on me. I wanted to do it faster, but realize it's much better to take a little extra time. And so for your kids, if they don't buy adult kids, if they don't buy a home this year and really it's 3 years later before they save up the down payment, is that a negative? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe that extra time in being a little patient was useful. And we've had a number of scenarios where parents look at how do I help my kids in the season, and they chose basically to do nothing, just to watch their kids, support their kids, be cheerleaders for their kids, but not to financially step in to allow their kids the time and the effort to really build some of those muscles and struggle with their own budget, struggle with those things to really build some of those skills they'll need later in life.
Yeah, truly, some of the best benefit you can give is guidance, advice. I think for parents to be vulnerable with their adult children, to talk about their own moments of difficulty or financial hardship when they were just starting out or trying to build a career or starting out as a young married couple. I think those can be encouraging and good advice. The other, in terms of tips and tricks, I would caution is making promises. Even if the current picture of your financial portfolio today looks stable and you anticipate having excess and being able to give on a regular basis, you never know what twists and turns are going to come in life and when you will need your own resources to provide for your needs, whether they're medical or ongoing sort of therapy or care. So I would hesitate or caution against making such firm promises because, oftentimes the recipient of that promise receives that commitment. They rely on you as their parents, and then they will structure their life in such a way that they do become dependent on that gift. And if that gift ever has to change, it can have major impact and circumstantially can alter a lot of factors in their life. So I think that's one just to caution against. Lead with guidance, lead with advice. Don't be afraid to watch them struggle. Right? As parents, we never want to watch our kids in pain or I don't like to use that term failure, but, fail in any way. But there's a learning opportunity there. And so anyways, just a caution again, so that you don't lead towards dependency, I think is what's most important.
Yeah. And a common one, just to give some examples there's a number of grandparents as they're starting to have grandkids, they say, wow, we're excited to pay for the private school, or we'll pay for college. We'll take care of that. And when they're saying that verbally, they may be thinking, yeah, college costs, 20 grand. Great. I can do that. Down the road, college is now costing 80 grand, a kid say, and there's something 1 or 2 grandkids, there's now 12 grandkids, right? That's a very different discussion. And if it was I just said a thing, we'll help, we'll contribute to a 529. That's very different than, like you said, Laura, making that promise to say, hey, we'll take care of this. And then 20 years later, when they're ready for college, it could be a very different scenario. So I think there's some real wisdom of wanting your family members to stand on their own feet, not be dependent, not be expecting those things, because life takes twists and turns.
So many tips and tricks. I hope some of these were helpful. And again, our disclaimer is that we are still in the midst of raising young kids. So we are talking from the perspective of our own experience as we were being raised. Thank you, Mom and Dad, if you're listening, for the wise advice and help that you gave to us. And also the things that we've learned and heard from with our clients and how we've been able to counsel them through this. And again, kudos and acknowledgement to those who are coming from the right heart motivation to say, how do I support my kids? I see that they're working hard and they're just trying to create a solid financial foundation to their life. I think that heart motivation is there, and that's the right place to start. And then be thoughtful and intentional about how you structure the benefit that you provide to them. And I wouldn't discount just your living example and proof and encouragement and guidance that you can give to them. And then ultimately, I always like to give just the disclaimer for those who are considering giving a gift or helping in a financial way, and you're not exactly sure how to structure it. You don't exactly know what tax implications are at play there. You're thinking through different options, and you just need a thought partner in the process. This is the work that we love to do, to come alongside our clients. It's not our plan, it's their plan. And every plan is unique, and their goals and their desires and their family dynamics. It makes the work that we do quite interesting. So if you need a thought partner in the process, don't go about this alone. Come in and have time to meet with us. We'd love the chance to partner with you.
All right, we look forward to hearing from you, and we look forward to talking to you next time.
We have a few more things to let you know about before we go. Podcast reviews really help us to serve more people and get this information into the hands of the people who need it. Please leave us a review. Even if it's not 5 stars, we welcome the feedback.
And we invite you to let us know what topics you would like to hear more about, or what would benefit the people in your life who you're closest to. We have more resources online. Those resources are designed to help you share this great information easily with people in your life. To access those resources, please visit trichordadvisors.com.
Often we hear from clients that they wish they had talked to us sooner. If that's you, we'd be thrilled to see how financial planning can benefit your life. Email us at contact@trichordadvisors.com or simply click on the link in the show notes.
We love creating content that's useful, resourceful, and maybe even a little entertaining. We want to make this mega universe of financial topics and advice applicable and helpful to your life.
Remember, at Trichord Advisors, we are your future's best ally.